The winter that year came harder than most, settling into the bones of the mountain like it had no intention of leaving. Walter hadn't expected anything unusual that morning, just another gray, frozen day at the edge of the woods, the same as the ones that had come before it. But something was waiting on his porch that would stay with him long after the snow finally melted. Walter Briggs was 73 years old and had lived alone in his cabin for nearly a decade. The place wasn't much. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, a narrow porch that looked out over a stand of spruce trees standing dark against the white. His nearest neighbor was 4 miles down the gravel road. He liked it that way. After his wife passed, the quiet had stopped feeling like loneliness and started feeling like something closer to peace. His mornings had a rhythm, the wood stove first, then a pot of coffee, then the slow creak of the old rocking chair as he watched the light change over the tree line. It wasn't a complicated life, but it was his, and he held it carefully. That morning, the thermometer on the porch railing read 12 degrees. Walter had gotten up before dawn, as he always did in winter, to stoke the fire before the cold worked its way through the floorboards. He was standing in the kitchen, holding his coffee cup with both hands, watching the first pale light begin to separate the sky from the tree line, when he heard it. A scratching sound, low and irregular, coming from just outside the front door. He set his cup down without thinking. His first instinct was a branch. The wind had been picking up through the night, and there was a spruce near the corner of the porch that sometimes dragged its limbs across the wood when the gusts came through. He'd been meaning to trim it for 2 seasons now. He stood still and listened. The sound came again, softer this time, more uneven. Not a branch. Walter moved slowly toward the door, the old floorboards sighing under his boots. He reached for the handle, paused for just a breath, then opened it. The cold hit him first, sharp and immediate, the kind that catches the back of your throat before you finish drawing a breath, and then he looked down. 5 small shapes were huddled together at the base of the door. For a moment, his mind didn't quite register what he was seeing. They were so small, so still, that in the pale gray of early morning they looked almost like a pile of leaves caught against the threshold. But then one of them shifted, a slow, trembling movement, and he saw the spotted fur, the oversized paws, the tiny tufted ears pressed flat against their heads. Bobcat kittens. 5 of them, pressed together for warmth, their small bodies shaking with a fine, continuous tremor. Their eyes were barely open. The smallest one, tucked in at the center of the group, wasn't moving at all. Walter stood in the doorway for only a few seconds. He wasn't a man who panicked, and he wasn't a man who overthought things when something in front of him needed doing. He'd grown up on this land. He understood, in the quiet and practical way of someone who had spent a lifetime watching the forest, exactly what the cold could do to something this small. He could already see it in the stillness of their bodies, in the dull, half-glazed look in their eyes. He went inside, pulled 2 wool blankets from the cedar chest beside the bed, and came back. He'd worked with animals his whole life, not as a vet, not as a wildlife officer, but as a man who had spent decades learning to read the land and everything that lived on it. He knew not to rush. He crouched low, moved slowly, and folded the first blanket into a loose cradle before easing the kittens together, one careful motion at a time. They didn't resist, they barely reacted. That, more than anything, told him how far gone they were. He carried them inside and closed the door behind him with his heel. He set them down near the fireplace, close enough to feel the heat, but not so close that the warmth would come too fast. He'd learned years ago that bringing something too cold back too quickly could cause its own kind of harm. He draped the second blanket gently over them and sat back on his heels, watching. For a long time, nothing happened. Then the smallest one, the one that hadn't been moving, let out a sound. It wasn't quite a cry. It was something smaller than that. A breath with a ragged edge to it. But it was there. Walter exhaled slowly. He got up, knees stiff, and went back to the kitchen to refill his coffee. He stood at the counter and looked through the doorway at the small rise and fall of the blanket near the hearth, listening for any sound from beneath it. Outside, the snow had started again, fine and steady, sifting down through the spruce branches, quietly filling in the tracks he'd left on the porch. He didn't know where their mother was. He didn't know how long they'd been out there before he heard them. He didn't know if all 5 of them would still be breathing by the time full daylight came. But for now, they were warm, and they were breathing,
and for now that was enough. By mid-morning the fire had done its work. The kitten stirred slowly at first, a paw stretching out from beneath the blanket, then a nose, then two small eyes blinking against the warmth of the room. Walter watched from his chair without moving, giving them time to find their bearings. He knew better than to crowd them. Trust with any wild thing was never something you reached for. It was something you waited for.
Within the hour they were moving.
Not gracefully, they were still unsteady on their feet, bumping into one another, sliding on the hardwood floor like they'd never quite negotiated a surface that smooth.
But they were moving, and that alone felt like something close to a miracle after the stillness he'd carried them in from the porch. The smallest one, the one that had worried him most, turned out to be the boldest. It was the first to venture away from the warmth of the hearth, padding in a wide, cautious circle around the leg of Walter's coffee table before losing interest and sitting down to clean its face with one oversized paw. Walter watched it and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized had been tight. By afternoon, the cabin was unrecognizable. One kitten had discovered the fringe on the edge of the braided rug and was attacking it with complete dedication. Two others had climbed onto the couch and were wrestling in a slow, clumsy way that sent them tumbling onto the cushions every few seconds. The fourth had wedged itself behind Walter's stack of firewood and seemed entirely satisfied with that decision. And the bold little one, the smallest, had climbed directly onto Walter's boot while he sat in his chair and fallen asleep there, one paw draped over his toe. He didn't move for a long time. He couldn't remember the last time the cabin had held this much sound. The small chirps and shuffling, the soft thud of a kitten finding the floor, the occasional high, thin call when one of them wandered too far from the others and wanted to be found. It was noise without weight, life without agenda. Walter heated a small amount of goat's milk he kept for his coffee and offered it carefully on a shallow dish.
They weren't sure about it at first. Then they were very sure about it.
He fed them twice before the light began to fail, then banked the fire for the night and settled into his chair. Outside, the snow had stopped. The forest was completely still. He sat and listened to 5 small animals breathing in the dark. And somewhere out in those frozen trees, he knew, something else was listening too.
Walter was up before the sun again. He'd slept lightly, the way he always did in deep winter. One ear half tuned to the fire, the other to the sounds of the cabin. The kittens had spent most of the night in a pile near the hearth, moving occasionally, murmuring in that small, feathery way they had. By the time the first gray light began pressing against the windows, all 5 were still accounted for, warm and breathing. He put the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window, watching the tree line take shape in the early dark. That's when he heard it, a sound at the door. But this time it was different. There was weight behind it, a slow, deliberate pressure, like something large shifting its footing on the porch boards. Not frantic, not aggressive, just present.
Walter set his cup down. He didn't go straight to the door. Instead, he moved to the side window, the narrow one that looked out across the front of the porch at an angle, and he leaned close to the glass and looked. She was standing at the door, a full-grown bobcat, easily 3 times the size of the animals sleeping behind him. Her coat was thick with winter, her breath rising in faint clouds in the frozen air. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't clawing at the wood. She was simply standing there, head low, eyes fixed on the door with an expression that Walter could only describe, quietly and without any embarrassment, as waiting. He stayed at the window for a long moment. In all his years on this land, he had seen bobcats at a distance, crossing a meadow at dusk, disappearing into brush. He had never stood this close to one, had never seen one stand so still in the presence of a human structure, so utterly unbothered by what that proximity meant. She knew something was on the other side of that door, and she had come anyway. Walter understood then what had happened. She hadn't abandoned them. She had likely been driven off, by the storm, by circumstance, and had spent the night searching. And now she had found them, or found the place that held them, by some combination of instinct and scent and the particular, ancient intelligence of a mother who has not yet given up. He stood very still. She raised her eyes, not to the window but to the door itself, and held them there. Walter exhaled slowly and walked toward the entrance. His hand rested on the handle for just a moment. Then he opened it. The cold came in around his ankles as the door swung open. Walter stood in the frame and did not move.
He kept his hands loose at his sides, his breathing slow and deliberate, the way he had learned to hold himself around any wild thing that hadn't yet decided what he was. The mother bobcat stood 6 feet away. Her eyes met his without flinching. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, from somewhere behind Walter, came a sound, a small, high chirp, instinctive and immediate. One of the kittens had heard something it recognized. Within seconds, all 5 were awake, stumbling toward the open door in that clumsy, urgent way of young animals answering a call older than thought. The mother lowered herself slightly as they spilled out onto the porch. She didn't rush toward them. She waited, let them come to her, and then she did what mothers do. She checked them, methodically, unhurried, moving from one to the next with her nose, reading each one the way only she could. Her whole body changed as she worked through them. The rigid alertness softened, her breath slowed. Whatever she had been carrying through that frozen night began, visibly, to leave her. Walter watched from the doorway and didn't say a word. When she had satisfied herself that all 5 were whole, she raised her head, and for a moment, brief and unrepeatable, she looked directly at him, not with fear, not with warning, with something quieter than either of those things, an acknowledgement perhaps, or simply the steady gaze of a creature that had gotten what it came for, and had no quarrel with the man who had kept it safe.
Walter held her eyes and gave her a single small nod. She turned. One by one the kittens followed her off the porch and into the snow, their small tracks pressing in beside hers as she moved toward the tree line. Walter watched them go, the mother steady and purposeful, the kittens tumbling along in her wake, the smallest one pausing once at the edge of the trees as if it had forgotten something, then turning and disappearing into the shadows with the rest. The forest closed around them like it had never been disturbed. Walter stood on the porch for a long time after they were gone. The cold didn't seem to bother him much. He was watching the place where they had disappeared, the slight impressions in the snow already beginning to soften at the edges. His cabin was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Fuller somehow, like something had passed through and left a little of itself behind. He went inside, poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, and sat down by the fire. Outside, the forest held its peace, and somewhere in the deep white stillness of those trees, a family moved together through the cold, whole and warm enough, and home.